Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
Passover at Mom's house always carried attention, so thick you could slice it with the same knife she used for the brisket, even before anyone said anything. Her dining room hadn't changed in 20 years, all polished cherry wood and floral seat cushions that smelled faintly of lemon pledge and old tension. The same brass chandelier hung like a low-hanging threat, and the same outdated family portraits watched us from the cream-colored wallpaper, frozen in time with synthetic smiles. The table was set for 12, but only 8 of us made it, one chair always left open for Elijah, and 3 more permanently vacant by divorce, resentment, and a cousin who moved to Oregon and apparently found Jesus. I sat between Leah and Mom, which was strategic. Mom had taken to pretending I was a fragile teacup after my so-called business failure, and Leah was the only one who didn't treat me like a family disappointment wrapped in a cardigan. Josh and Karen arrived last, as always, their coats still damp from the drizzle outside. Josh walked in like he owned the house, though he'd never put a dime into it. Karen trailed behind him in that effortless upper saddle river glam she'd mastered, a wine-colored blouse, gold hoop earrings, a lip gloss smile. We did the blessings, passed the matzo, dipped the greens. Josh led the reading like he was a rabbi's understudy, his voice smooth, confident, too perfect. When we got to the part about the 10 plagues, I noticed he read locusts like he'd personally battled them with a briefcase and a bonus check. I just stared into my wine glass like it held better company. We were halfway through the main course when it happened. The smirk. That goddamn smirk. Josh was cutting into his brisket, extra fatty, just the way he liked it, when he leaned back in his chair and tossed his napkin onto the table like he was bored with us. "Not everyone's built for the real world," he said casually, as if it were a comment about the weather, like it wasn't a direct missile aimed at my ribs. "Some people just don't have the grit for it, you know?" I didn't look up right away. I took a sip of wine, then another, and reminded myself this was Mom's house, her holiday, her table. Don't give him the satisfaction, Rachel. Don't let him see it. He'd always done this, weaponized holidays like they were battlegrounds, picking just the right moment to drop a passive-aggressive grenade and wait for the explosion. Mom tried to change the subject, fumbling with the salt. "Rachel, didn't you say you saw that new exhibit at the Met?" she offered weakly, her voice half hoping to steer the moment away. But I didn't answer her because that's when Leah finally spoke. She hadn't said much all night, just quietly passing the cassette and watching everyone like she was taking mental notes. But now she looked up, right at Josh, with a stare that could cut diamonds. "Then why," she said slowly, her voice calm but cold, "does your former office have her logo on it now?" I blinked. Josh stopped chewing mid-bite. Karen froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Mom dropped hers entirely. It clinked against the edge of her plate like a cymbal in a jazz funeral. The silence that followed was so loud it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Josh looked at Leah, then at me, then back at Leah like he'd misheard. What he finally managed, but the words sounded small coming from his smug little mouth. Leah didn't blink. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. She dropped the line like a match on dry grass, and now she was watching the fire spread. I saw Josh's throat move as he swallowed hard. His face was turning pale, like someone had pulled the plug on his blood supply. He looked at me again, and I could see it in his eyes, the scrambling, the calculations, the panic trying to stay hidden under that crumbling mask of confidence. I set my wine glass down carefully, making no effort to deny it. I didn't have to. The words were still hanging there, sharp and inescapable. Mom looked between us, her eyes wide. "Rachel," she said slowly, cautiously, "what's she talking about?" I didn't answer. Not yet. Because the truth? That answer would ruin dessert. And that was exactly the plan. 1 year earlier, almost to the day, I was sitting in the back corner of a cheap cafe on 8th Avenue, trying to look like a woman with a plan when in reality I was a woman who hadn't paid her electric bill in 3 weeks. It was one of those early March days where the wind bites through your coat like it's got something personal against you, and I remember thinking, maybe this is it, maybe this is what rock bottom actually looks like. My phone buzzed with another credit card denial notification, and the waitress kept giving me the kind of look you give someone nursing a single cup of coffee for nearly 2 hours. I'd had $24,000 left to my name, if you didn't count the 3 maxed-out cards or the $28,000 I owed the IRS from a bookkeeping mistake I still say wasn't mine. That's barely enough for rent in New York for 5 years, okay? Maybe less if you count utilities and, food. But at the time, I clung to that number like it meant something, like it was a shield against collapse. That number became a mantra. 24,000 left means you're not done yet. It means there's still time. So when I got the call from an old broker I used to work with, one of those greasy guys with bad teeth and good instincts, I almost didn't answer. But something told me to pick up, and when he said the office on 8th Avenue was officially foreclosed and hitting auction within the month, I just froze. That office. Josh's office. The one he bragged about for years, the one with the floor-to-ceiling glass, and the espresso machine that cost more than my car. He had lost it 6 months earlier after a liquidity event, which is Wall Street code for we royally screwed someone and they found out. The press didn't cover the whole mess, but enough slipped through the cracks: fraud allegations, insider tips, a quiet settlement, and then poof, Josh's hedge fund dissolved like sugar in tea. He walked away without jail time, because that's how it works when you know the right people and screw over the right kind of clients. What people didn't know was that building was technically owned by a holding company, which went bankrupt during the fallout. It went quiet, off-market, and most people assumed it had been absorbed into some other soulless corporate shell. But I knew better. I knew what it meant. I also knew I had exactly one shot to grab it before someone else did. So I went to the auction. I went wearing a blazer I hadn't fit into properly since the Obama administration, with shaking hands and a fake smile. I registered under a different name, an LLC I had formed 6 months earlier, one of those vague consulting shells that no one looks too hard at. I bid quietly. No drama. No waving paddles or raised eyebrows. Just a subtle nod when the number was right and a blank face when the gavel dropped. 3 weeks later, it was mine. Well, not mine technically. It was owned by Fell Group Partners, a name I picked because it sounded like something old, white, and expensive. No one ever asked what it meant, and I never told them that Feld was short for Feldman. No one looked at the woman signing the papers with bitten nails and a $19 haircut and thought, that's the new owner of Josh Feldman's empire. And that was exactly how I wanted it. I spent 6 months gutting the place. Painted over the old Navy walls he used to think made him look powerful. Replaced the leather chairs he insisted were Italian with clean, sustainable wood seating. Got rid of the pretentious espresso machine and installed a simple coffee station with handwritten labels and free mugs. Every detail was chosen not to scream success, but to whisper competence, a thing Josh never really understood. By September, I had quietly opened the doors of a small but sharp boutique consultancy, focused on helping women-led startups navigate investment pitches and survive the meat grinder of early funding. I didn't put my name on the door. I didn't send out press releases. I told myself I didn't want revenge. I just wanted space to breathe, to build, to prove that I wasn't broken. And I would have kept it that way, anonymous, private, mine, if it hadn't been for Leah. Back at the dinner table, Josh's voice cracked just enough to betray him. "You're lying," he said, but his voice was quieter now, like he was afraid the truth might echo. I didn't answer right away. I just reached for my wine, careful not to spill it on Mom's white tablecloth. I sipped it slowly, not because I needed the taste, but because silence was my power now. Across the table, Leah looked calm, but there was fire behind her eyes. It wasn't just about me. I could see it now. She wanted this just as badly, for reasons I didn't yet understand. Josh's wife Karen had gone pale, staring at her lap like it might save her. Mom kept looking between us all, her fork abandoned, lips parted as if caught mid-prayer. And me? I smiled. Not a big smile. Just enough. Just enough to make him nervous. Just enough to let him know this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Josh always had this way of recovering after getting knocked down, not emotionally, not like the rest of us do, but with the slickness of a man who's never had to bleed to earn anything in his life. He took a slow sip from his water glass, not wine, because God forbid he lose composure when the spotlight turned harsh. His fingers tightened slightly around the stem, knuckles paling just enough for me to notice, and that alone was satisfying in a petty way. For the first time in years, he didn't have full control of the room, and it showed in how long he took to look back up at me. The air was thick with awkward silence, except for the faint clink of silverware being nervously adjusted by people who suddenly found their plates fascinating. "Even if you bought it," he finally said, dragging the words out like he needed to test each one before letting it out into the air, "you still used what Dad left you." All of this, he gestured vaguely, as though waving his hand could cover my entire life, was never from scratch. You always had backup. You just never had to admit it. And there it was, the jab meant to discredit everything I'd built. It came dressed in a rational tone, but it was every bit a knife sharpened with smugness. He wanted to rewrite history in front of the whole family, needed to paint me as someone who had a secret leg up, a safety net, anything that might explain why he was no longer the only Feldman who could afford tailored suits and real estate. His voice was calm, but his words carried venom, the kind that only works if no one else at the table remembers the truth. The truth is this: when Dad died, Josh got the house in Ridgewood, the Acura TL that still had less than 20,000 miles on it, and the entire network of contacts Dad spent 30 years building in finance and property development. Leah got the family silverware and a bond account she couldn't touch until she turned 30. And me? I got a cracked leather briefcase that still smelled like Dad's pipe tobacco and a handwritten note that said, "Make something that matters." There wasn't a check tucked inside, no secret savings bond hidden in a pocket, just a crooked, nostalgic smile scrawled in ink and the quiet implication that I was supposed to figure the rest out on my own. I remember standing in the lawyer's office that day, hearing the breakdown of Dad's estate, wondering if maybe I had misheard something, if this was some kind of administrative error that would be cleared up by Tuesday. But it wasn't. The will had been executed exactly as written. Josh got power and property. Leah got symbols and savings. I got legacy, apparently. Legacy and a note. And I played nice. I told myself Dad must have had a reason, must have believed I was capable of more. I swallowed my resentment with coffee and fake gratitude for years, because what else do you do when your own father tells you to start from scratch? So now, for Josh to sit at this table and claim I somehow had it easy, it felt like an erasure, a slap in the face delivered with a polite tone and a smug tilt of the chin. "I didn't inherit Jack," I said, voice low and even, but with that tightness in my chest I always get when I'm trying not to explode. "You got the house, the contacts, the car, and the keys. I got a broken briefcase and a lesson in bootstrapping. Don't rewrite this just because I didn't stay down." Josh opened his mouth again, but before he could launch into whatever version of the past he was about to invent, Karen, silent, tight-lipped Karen, shifted in her chair and muttered something just loud enough to slice through the air. "Well, if we're being honest," she said, and her voice was just slightly slurred from her third glass of wine, "I've seen the paperwork." You could feel the shift instantly, like every molecule of air in the room paused to listen more closely. I blinked. Leah's head turned so fast it was almost theatrical. Mom sat completely still, her expression confused but alert, like her brain was working double time to catch up. Josh froze. "What paperwork?" I asked, already knowing from the way Karen bit her lip and looked down at her lap that this was going to be the kind of answer that lived in your bones for years. Josh muttered something unintelligible, but Karen kept her gaze fixed somewhere near the middle of the table, like she couldn't quite face me directly. Her voice was slower now, like someone unraveling a thread they weren't sure they should touch. After your dad passed, she said carefully, there was a second set of trust documents. I wasn't supposed to see them, but I did. A few times, actually. And there was a name on them. Your name. She didn't look at me, but she didn't need to. Every head at the table had turned in my direction now, as if I was suddenly the most volatile piece of this strange family equation. I felt my stomach clench, not from surprise, but from something colder, something that felt like recognition. What kind of trust? I asked again, but my voice was lower this time, more measured. Karen exhaled slowly and finally looked up at me, eyes a little glassy now. A silent one, she said. Meant to give you seed money, startup capital or something. I don't remember the details. But Josh signed some paperwork years ago to consolidate things. Said it was too complicated to manage all the accounts. I turned to Josh, but he was staring at his plate now like it might offer an exit from this reality. His jaw was tight, his fists clenched slightly on the tablecloth. The image was so ironic I almost laughed. After all these years of pretending I wasn't capable, it turns out he'd actively made sure I stayed down. And Leah, quiet, perceptive Leah, wasn't even looking at Josh. She was watching me, her expression unreadable but sharp as glass. She knew something. Maybe she always had. Is that true? I asked him, but he didn't answer. Because Josh, the great speaker, the hedge fund master, the family golden boy, suddenly had nothing to say. There's a very specific kind of silence that hits a family table when something real finally slices through all the polite noise and holiday niceties. It's not peaceful, and it's not empty either. It's the kind of silence that crackles with electricity and unspoken curses, the kind that makes even the candles on the table seem to flicker with anticipation. That was the air around us as Karen's words settled in, as the implications slowly wormed their way into everyone's heads and began to bloom like mold under a sink. And all I could think, as I stared at my brother's suddenly ghost-white face, was how long he'd been waiting for me to fail, how long he must have been enjoying watching me claw and scrape for scraps while sitting on what was rightfully mine. It wasn't just betrayal. It wasn't just disrespect. It was theft, and it had a paper trail. Mom didn't speak, not yet. Her fork lay limp beside her plate like even she had surrendered to the storm. Leah had turned entirely toward me now, eyes locked onto mine, and her face was unreadable, though I could feel something burning just beneath the surface. I looked back at Josh, waiting for him to say something, a denial, a justification, even a lie, but instead he just opened and closed his mouth once like a fish gasping for water in a dry bowl. Karen, perhaps realizing she'd broken open something bigger than expected, shifted in her seat and ran a hand through her hair, clearly trying to walk the tightrope between honesty and damage control. I wasn't supposed to see it, she said again, her voice lower now, almost apologetic. It was just. I was sorting out taxes one year, and there it was, a transfer from one of the trusts. It listed your name, Rachel. It was supposed to be set aside for you after the estate was settled. 50,000, I think. 50,000. That number hit me like a slap across the face. Not because it was enormous, not in today's world, not in New York, but because it was exactly the amount I had once needed to keep my first startup alive. That startup, the one that flopped after 10 months of grinding and pitching and sleepless nights, would have made it if I'd had even half of that. I'd blamed myself for that failure for years. I'd internalized it, swallowed it down with shame and quiet apologies I never should have had to make. But now, sitting there at that stupid table with brisket going cold and Elijah's empty chair mocking us from the corner, I realized it wasn't just a personal failure. It was sabotage disguised as silence. I stood up without thinking. My chair scraped back across the hardwood floor, a sudden harsh sound that made Mom flinch. My hands were shaking now, not from weakness, but from rage so sharp and focused it made everything else in the room blur around the edges. I had spent the last 15 years fighting to be taken seriously while Josh sat smugly in his glass office towers, telling anyone who would listen that his sister just didn't have the killer instinct. You signed it away, I said, and my voice wasn't loud, but it carried, like every word had been dipped in gasoline. You took what Dad left for me and folded it into your own damn portfolio like it was nothing. You watched me struggle. You watched me lose everything, and you didn't say a goddamn word. Josh finally looked up, and to his credit, or maybe his stupidity, he didn't deny it. Instead, he gave me that look he always gives people when he's backed into a corner, the one where his eyes narrow and he tries to speak like he's still in control. It wasn't personal, he said flatly, as if those words could undo the years. Not personal? I laughed, sharp and ugly. You stole from me, Josh. You took my chance, and you handed it to yourself like it was a business write-off. Karen reached out like she might touch his arm, but then pulled back, as if she wasn't quite sure which side of the table she belonged to anymore. I leaned forward slightly, planting both hands on the table, meeting his gaze with a steadiness I didn't know I had in me. I built something anyway, I said, quieter now but still crackling. I made something from nothing, because that's what you left me with. And the funny thing is, you thought I wouldn't find out. You thought I wouldn't matter. Josh tried again, his voice more defensive now, brittle around the edges. You got what you wanted in the end. What difference does it make? And that's when I smiled, not because anything was funny, but because I'd been waiting for this moment since the day I saw the foreclosure notice on his old office, since the day I decided I'd stop being invisible. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up with tomorrow's date and a draft of the press release sitting in my email, waiting to be sent. My thumb hovered over it for just a second before I locked the screen again and looked up, calm and deliberate. Well, I said, and I let the words sit there like bait. I guess I won't feel bad about tomorrow's headline. Josh's eyes locked onto mine, and he went pale again. What the hell did you do? He asked, but there was fear in his voice now, a tiny crack in the marble that made my heart beat just a little slower. The silence returned, heavier now, because nobody, not Karen, not Leah, not even Mom, asked me to explain. They all knew something had shifted. The balance of power at that table had finally tipped. And I wasn't about to tip it back. The thing about revenge, real, bone-deep, slow-cooked revenge, is that it doesn't explode like fireworks. It simmers, almost invisible, until the room's filled with smoke and no one remembers when the fire started. I never wanted the kind of vengeance you see in movies with screaming and slamming doors and lawsuits flying like confetti. I wanted the quiet kind, the kind that leaves someone realizing what they lost just as they reach for it again. I didn't want him destroyed. I wanted him diminished. Diminished in the eyes of the people he spent a lifetime trying to impress. That's worse, somehow being looked at with pity instead of fear. Josh didn't know it, but the moment Karen said paperwork, the final card in the deck had already been dealt. It had been a long game, and I had played it slow. I'd waited 10 years, not because I'm patient by nature, but because I had no other choice. After Dad's funeral, when Josh had pulled ahead in the race for legacy, I spent nearly every week wondering what would have happened if I'd just had that startup capital, if I'd just had one safety net to catch me. I went broke. I failed publicly. I started over. And every single move I made after that was to position myself for a moment like this one. The shell company I used to buy Josh's former office wasn't even mine on paper. It belonged to a friend of mine from college, one of the few people who stuck around after the bottom dropped out on me. We'd drawn up the paperwork together over wine and leftover takeout, laughing not because it was funny, but because we both knew how close failure and power really were. I bought the building 3 weeks after it officially dropped below market value in a quiet auction nobody noticed, because the listing was disguised as a bundle. Just a line item among a dozen anonymous pieces of property. And now, after 4 years of careful upgrades and quiet tenants, I'd made the final move, sold it again, this time to a firm with teeth. Not just any firm, though. The very one that had once tried to investigate Josh's hedge fund back when everything first started to smell like rot. Ethics Core, A firm run by ex-prosecutors who didn't need to break laws because they knew how to weaponize them legally. Tomorrow morning, they were moving in. Tomorrow morning, the new brass logo would go up. Tomorrow morning, the Times would run a quiet little piece about how a previously disgraced financier's former office had been acquired by a company dedicated to exposing corporate corruption. And not a single sentence of that article would mention me. That's what made it beautiful. Josh still hadn't answered my question. He was still frozen in his seat, like he might undo the past with enough silence. But Leah, quiet, clever Leah, was watching me now with something different in her eyes. Something I hadn't seen from her in years. It wasn't shock. It wasn't fear. It was understanding. She'd known, I realized. She'd known something long before tonight. The way she dropped that bomb earlier, the timing, the precision, none of it was accidental. I leaned back into my chair again, the wood creaking slightly under my weight. "You want to know how I knew?" I asked, still looking at Josh but speaking to the room. "How I found out about the trust." Josh didn't answer. Karen had folded into herself, like she wished she could disappear into the floor. Mom was clutching her wine glass like it might shatter if she let go. "I didn't," I said softly. "Not at first. I thought I'd just been ignored. Like always. But someone else saw it? Someone else told me." And then I turned to Leah. She didn't blink. She just nodded, once, slow and firm. "I found it," she said, her voice calm but sharp, 3 years ago. "Buried in a box of tax folders at Mom's house. Your name was on it." I didn't say anything until I knew you were ready to hear it. Josh's head snapped toward her. "You what?" Leah finally stood up, not angry, not yelling, just standing, strong and solid. "You did the same thing to me, remember? You convinced Dad not to co-sign my grad school loans. Said I'd be better off working first, getting real-world experience. You always knew how to say just enough to push us out of the way without leaving fingerprints." Her words landed like a fist in slow motion. "You ruined her chance," she said, nodding toward me. "And you took mine before I even had one." Josh stood up so suddenly his chair nearly toppled backward. His face was flushed, and for the first time in my life, I saw panic etched across his features without any attempt to hide it. "You've been feeding her information?" "This whole time." "No," Leah said. "Just the truth. You'd be amazed how much power truth still has when someone's finally ready to use it." Josh looked at me, eyes wide, breathing shallow. "You don't have to do this. You're better than this." I stared at him, then picked up my wine glass and swirled it gently, not even sipping it yet. "Maybe I'm not," I said. And with that, he stormed out, coat unbuttoned, shoulders tight, the same man who used to control every room now, losing control of his own feet. The front door slammed harder than it needed to, but it didn't matter. He was already gone. The rest of the room stayed still. Karen got up slowly, excused herself, and followed, not offering any parting words. Just silence. Mom stayed quiet, but her eyes followed me with something close to recognition. Not pride, not judgment, just recognition. Like she was seeing me clearly for the first time in a decade. Leah sat down again beside me, poured herself another glass of wine, and took a long drink. "He deserved worse," she said simply. I didn't answer. I just kept staring at the space where Josh had been, wondering if I had crossed a line or finally redrawn one. Some people break you. Others sharpen you. And sometimes they're the same person. I looked at my sister and wondered, when exactly did we trade justice for revenge?